For 126 days, 72 of Peru's most important political and diplomatic figures were held hostage inside the Japanese ambassador's residence, trapped by a group of heavily armed insurgents. What the captors never imagined was that quietly and methodically, the Peruvian military and government were executing a daring rescue plan right beneath their feet. An entire underground operation involving expert miners, a network of secret underground tunnels, hidden spy devices, encrypted communications, and a flawless split-second attack. This is Operation Chavín de Huántar, one of the most brilliant and successful hostage rescue missions in history. Lima, Peru, December 17, 1996. Inside an elegant mansion located in the exclusive district of San Isidro, a huge party was being prepared. The residence was owned by the Japanese ambassador Morihisa Aoki, who had invited more than 600 people to his house, including diplomats, businessmen, ministers, military officers, and other distinguished high-class individuals in celebration of the 63rd birthday of Japanese Emperor Akihito. The night began and guests started to arrive. By 8 p.m. all the guests had arrived and the celebration was unfolding as planned. Out in the street, an ambulance stopped in front of a house at the back of the residence where the party was taking place. A paramedic stepped out and pretended to need help with something, approaching a guard and asking if he knew the address he was looking for. When the guard was instructed, another man appeared, pointed a weapon at his head and ordered him to let them in discreetly. A total of 14 individuals took the house and planted an explosive on one of the walls. At 8:19 p.m., a huge blast was heard by all the guests at the party, and within seconds the 14 individuals entered the residence garden through the hole in the wall. The intruders were dressed in black clothing, with white and red kerchiefs covering their faces. They were heavily armed with an arsenal that included assault rifles, submachine guns, revolvers, pistols, smoke and fragmentation grenades, radios, gas masks, bulletproof vests, and even an RPG-7 rocket launcher. Peru in the 1980s had lived through one of the darkest chapters in its modern history. The country was torn apart by terrorism, most of it driven by Shining Path, a Maoist insurgency whose brutal car bombings, assassinations, and massacres left tens of thousands dead. By the early 1990s, Shining Path had become synonymous with fear, the group every Peruvian associated with chaos and indiscriminate violence. So when the blast tore through the wall and all the unknown men stormed in, many of the guests froze, convinced that Shining Path had come for them. But the Shining Path was not the only group fueling this reign of terror. While far smaller and less lethal than Shining Path, the MRTA, Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru, had made a name for itself through kidnappings, bank robberies, ambushes, and urban guerrilla operations throughout the 1980s and early 90s. Inspired by Marxist-Leninist and Cuban revolutionary ideals, they sought to overthrow the Peruvian government, but by 1997 they were a weakened, cornered organization with most of its members imprisoned. This was the real group behind the attack. Of the 14 attackers, 12 were men and 2 were women. The leader of the organization, Nestor Serpa Cartolini, was present among them. Their target was not chosen at random. The Japanese ambassador's residence was, at that moment, the most strategic and politically symbolic location they could strike. Japan was Peru's largest foreign ally, its main lender, and one of Fujimori's closest diplomatic partners. For a president who built his political identity on strength, order, and his proud Japanese heritage, an attack on Japanese soil right in the heart of Lima was a direct blow. Police were soon notified and arrived at the scene, where a brief but violent shootout unfolded. Within moments, the outskirts of the residence were filled with reporters as well. Police fired tear gas, but this turned out to be counterproductive, affecting only the hostages, since the attackers were fully equipped with gas masks. After a while, Serpe stood with a megaphone to threaten the police. One more attack and they will kill all of the hostages. He then warned them, saying, "If all of you die tonight, it won't be our fault, but the government's." News didn't take long to reach President Alberto Fujimori, whose mother and sister were among the hostages. Serpe's demands were the release of 456 imprisoned MRTA members, including this woman, Nancy Hilvonio, his wife. Their transfer to the Peruvian jungle with 15 hostages as a guarantee, a complete overhaul of the country's academic system, and $6 million in what they called a war tax, money intended to finance their armed cause. If at least the first demand wasn't met by the next day, Chancellor Francisco Tudela, the most important hostage for the Peruvian government, would be executed. Tudela was terrified because he knew it was impossible for Fujimori to ever accept those demands. Michael Meaning, delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross, stood up and dared to speak with Serpe in an attempt to convince him to release the most vulnerable hostages. Surprisingly, Meaning succeeded by framing it as a humanitarian gesture, one that would show the outside world that Serpe's organization could be trusted and had principles, exactly the kind of propaganda they needed. That's how just a few hours after the takeover, Serpe released the event workers, the elderly and the women. However, this turned out to be his first major mistake, because among the dozens of women living the residence were Mutsue Inomoto and Juana Fujimori, the mother and sister of President Alberto Fujimori. By the time he realized it, it was too late. He had let go of two of his most valuable bargaining chips. By the next day, the government had not made any public statement, so Serpe ordered Francisco Tudela to be brought before him. He pointed his gun at Tudela's head and told him he admired his political work as a chancellor, adding that it was a shame he had to kill him. Tudela lowered his head, accepting his fate. But nothing happened. The gun was unloaded. Serpe knew he couldn't kill Tudela, because the moment he did, the army would storm the residence, vastly outnumbering his group and killing them all. That wasn't part of his plan. Days went by and Serpe continued releasing hostages who were not directly linked to the Peruvian government. By day 4, President Alberto Fujimori made his first public announcement. He condemned the act and rejected all of the demands. He called for a peaceful solution, promising that the government wouldn't use force if the captors released all of the hostages.
Que los captores depongan las armas ante una comisión de garantías y que faciliten la evacuación de todos los rehenes, sin excepción. De esta manera, también quedará descartada la posibilidad del uso de la fuerza por parte del Estado peruano y de allí, con toda garantía, una salida que se puede estudiar.
What almost no one knew was that Fujimori's prolonged silence and these peaceful words were just a curtain. On the very night of the attack, Fujimori had spoken with Vladimiro Montesinos, the head of Peru's National Intelligence Service. They were already crafting a plan. The first idea was called Operación Papá Noel, Operation Santa Claus, and consisted of using the sound of fireworks as a distraction to launch an assault on Christmas night. But the idea was too risky. Given that all MRTA members had clear instructions to kill all the hostages in the event of any military operation, it was quickly discarded. They needed a plan that would allow them to catch the rebels by surprise and eliminate them before they could react. That's how they came up with the definitive plan, a network of secret underground tunnels. Named after the ancient subterranean temples of the Chavín culture, Operation Chavín de Huántar was born. The government recruited 32 miners and brought them from Cerro de Pasco, a mining city located in the central Andes of Peru. Cerro de Pasco's miners were simply the best in Peru for this kind of work. They were recruited in complete secrecy and kept fully isolated from their families to prevent any leakage of information. The government rented the houses behind the ambassador's residence, and from there, the miners began digging. The government set up huge speakers outside the residence and played music at extreme volume. Everyone believed it was a psychological warfare tactic against the MRTA, but in reality the music served a different purpose, to mask the sound of the digging. Then, at midnight, multiple trucks transported the removed soil. The plan called for the construction of 4 tunnels. The main tunnel would extend 128 meters beneath the residence and end in 4 exit points. The first exit, placed beside the second-floor outer staircase, would serve as the route for evacuating the hostages. The other 3 exits would emerge in the lateral garden and allow a commando unit to breach the lateral wall and storm the residence. Before reaching the second exit, the main tunnel would split, creating a massive 60-meter branch that crossed underneath the living room, dining room, and library, strategic points where explosives would later be planted. 2 additional tunnels, each about 20 meters long, would be dug behind the residence and used as extra entry points for commandos attacking from the rear. Weeks passed and the negotiations didn't progress. The government had cut off electricity and water from the residence. The restrooms were no longer usable, food was scarce, and the summer heat made everything worse. Life inside the residence had become precarious, and under these conditions the MRTA had no option but to accept the help of the Red Cross and the Human Rights Organization. They provided them with water, food, portable toilets, Bibles, religious paintings, and all sorts of useful items. What they didn't know was the intelligence service had implanted tiny microphones and spy video cameras on these items. They were watching and hearing everything from the other side, but now the problem was for them to be heard. And this is where this man's role became extremely important. This is Admiral Luis Gianpietri Rojas, one of the biggest heroes of this story. He had experience in combat against terrorism, and as soon as he saw the religious paintings and all the new items, he knew there had to be hidden microphones everywhere. On the day of the takeover, the attackers confiscated every cell phone from the hostages, but one of them had managed to sneak in a beeper, and he secretly handed it to Gianpietri, hoping it might prove useful. Convinced that surveillance devices were hidden somewhere inside the supplies, Gianpietri began speaking directly to the religious paintings, Bibles, and all the other items whenever the guards were nearby. But that wasn't enough. They needed a way to confirm that someone on the outside was actually hearing them. That's when Francisco Tudela came up with a clever idea: use the loudspeakers outside. All Gianpietri had to do was request a specific song. If the song played, it would mean they were being heard through hidden microphones. They chose La Cucaracha. Gianpietri moved from item to item, the paintings, the Bibles, anything that could be hiding a transmitter, repeating the same phrase: "If you can hear me, play La Cucaracha." After several attempts, the speakers that were masking the miner's excavation suddenly blasted the song. That confirmed it. The microphones were real, and someone on the other side was listening to every word. With this breakthrough, Gianpietri continued speaking, now providing his beeper number, and soon a functional communication channel was finally established. From that moment on, Gianpietri pretended to be talking to himself while holding a Bible. The other hostages and even the attackers believed he had lost his mind, so they stopped paying attention to him. What they didn't know was the Bible contained a hidden microphone. Every word Gianpietri spoke was actually part of an encoded message, transmitting valuable information that an intelligence team was decoding on the other side. And when the team needed to send a message back, they simply sent it to his beeper. The system was flawless. By March 1997, President Fujimori met with Fidel Castro in Cuba. During this meeting, Castro sent an unexpected message to the MRTA. If they released the hostages, Cuba would receive them. Because the MRTA admired and shared the ideology of the Cuban regime, Castro's words struck Serpa deeply. For the first time, he began to doubt the mission. He even gathered the other 13 members for a private meeting, confessing that all he truly wanted now was the release of his wife Nancy from prison, and once he had her, they could all flee to Cuba. But the others rejected this completely. They insisted on fulfilling their original objectives and began viewing Serpa, the Rome commander, as someone betraying the cause. And that entire tense discussion was overheard by the intelligence team, thanks to a microphone hidden inside one of the coffee thermoses. One day, Serpa heard unusual noises coming from beneath the floor and immediately suspected the existence of tunnels.
Nosotros hemos venido escuchando algunos ruidos debajo de lo que podía ser el piso de la residencia en sí, ¿no? Todo indica, digamos, que existe sin duda, o por lo menos hay la intención de nuestro punto de vista, preparar un ataque militar. El día de mañana no vamos a asistir a las conversaciones.
A few days later, several journalists noticed the trucks discreetly transporting soil at night. Because of this, the next morning, March 7, 1987, the nation woke up to this front page from the newspaper La República. They had revealed the tunnels to the public, despite the government's exhaustive efforts to keep the operation completely secret. Fujimori was forced to respond publicly. He stated that the government didn't rule out the possibility of tunnels, just as it did not rule out an aerial assault, sniper intervention, or any other strategy. Serpa, increasingly paranoid, made his second major mistake. He moved all the hostages to the second floor, convinced the government was preparing an escape route for them through tunnels. Ironically, this blunder worked in the government's favor. Now every hostage was far away from the first floor, the exact area where the real action of the operation was meant to unfold. To kill boredom, the attackers began organizing daily afternoon football matches inside the living room. It became a routine that Serpa and his men followed without fail, a routine confirmed by Gianpietri, by the microphones and by the hidden cameras. A routine meant a pattern, and a pattern meant an opportunity. This moment of the day was chosen for the operation, when the attackers would be distracted and most vulnerable to a surprise assault. Meanwhile, the military had been training a specialized team with extensive experience in hostage rescue and counter-terrorism. They even built an exact replica of the residence using the original architectural plans to make the training as precise as possible. The commandos rehearsed until every movement was perfected, and the final training session was supervised by Fujimori himself, who approved the operation immediately. It was no effect, only a matter of time before the operation was executed. But before that, several key conditions had to be met to ensure its success, all of which were sent as direct instructions to Gianpietri's beeper. The first instruction was that the main door of the second floor had to be opened, because it led to the outer staircase, the primary route the Delta team would use to evacuate the hostages. The second instruction required every hostage to wear light-colored clothing, so they could be easily identified and distinguished from the terrorists, who all wore dark clothes. The third instruction demanded that all 14 MRTA members be engaged in their daily football match to guarantee they would be distracted and taken completely by surprise. And the fourth instruction was a verbal confirmation code: Mary is sick. When Gianpietri spoke this phrase into the microphone hidden inside the Bible, it signaled that all previous conditions had been met and the operation could begin. April 22, 1997. After 126 days of captivity, the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. This was the day the 148 commandos had spent months preparing for. They had already been positioned inside the tunnels for nearly 33 hours, waiting for the final confirmation. During a phone call between Fujimori and Montesinos, Fujimori gave the order to begin the operation. At around 3:20 p.m., Gianpietri spoke the coded words, "Mary is sick," confirming that all conditions for the operation had been met. But two unexpected setbacks nearly compromised everything. First, a police helicopter suddenly flew over the residence, causing the MRTA members to halt their football match and assume defensive positions. Second, the explosives failed to detonate due to dead batteries, forcing last-minute replacements. Despite these complications, there was no turning back. The operation had already been authorized. And so, at 3:23 p.m., the charges finally detonated, marking the start of Operation Chavín de Huántar. That's how 148 commandos suddenly stormed the residence, attacking from the front, the rear, the sides, and of course from below. The initial explosions instantly killed 5 MRTA members positioned in those areas. The remaining insurgents ran to the second floor to kill the hostages, but 6 of them were intercepted by commandos as they moved up the stairs. With this, the second group of insurgents, including their leader, Nestor Sarpa Cartolini, was eliminated. The MRTA member responsible for guarding Tudela rushed to the room where he was usually held, but when he arrived, Tudela wasn't there. At the last minute, Tudela and the other hostages had changed locations, knowing the insurgents would search for them with murderous intent as soon as the explosions began. The attacker ran to another room on the second floor, where he saw Tudela trying to escape. He threw a grenade, but it bounced off a door frame, and the explosion only slightly injured the Chancellor. The attacker then fired his weapon, and one of the bullets struck Tudela in the leg. Even wounded, Tudela continued fleeing toward the terrace, so the attacker chased after him. When he was about to shoot, Colonel Juan Valer Sandoval, whose mission was specifically to protect the Chancellor, pushed Tudela out of the line of fire, saving his life. Unfortunately, 2 of the bullets hit the colonel, one in the neck and the other in the liver. Despite the commandos immediately eliminating the attacker, Colonel Valer died from his injuries. Captain Raúl Jiménez Chavez was also killed, struck by an enemy grenade while assisting a wounded teammate. After just 33 minutes from the first explosion, the operation was over. All 14 MRTA members had been neutralized and the hostages secured. Only one hostage didn't survive: Supreme Court Justice Carlos Justi Acuña, who was shot in the leg. The bullet severed his femoral artery, leading to a fatal heart attack. Hours later, President Fujimori himself arrived at the residence. To celebrate the success of the operation, he sang the national anthem alongside the commandos. The MRTA flag was taken down and replaced with Peru's national flag. The operation was considered a resounding success. In only 33 minutes, every MRTA member had been eliminated, and just 2 commandos and 1 hostage were killed, far fewer than anticipated. In the end, the MRTA was completely dismantled, but the operation left a complex legacy. In the years that followed, families of the militants and human rights organizations filed complaints alleging extrajudicial executions. Former hostage Hidetaka Okura even claimed that 3 MRTA members who had surrendered were executed after lowering their weapons. Years later, several military personnel were briefly arrested on charges of aggravated homicide and cover-up against the Peruvian state. The case, however, was eventually closed, and all accused officers were released. Not long after, the political landscape shifted. Alberto Fujimori and Vladimiro Montesinos, once celebrated for the rescue, ended up imprisoned for the crimes committed during the regime in the 90s. Today, the full-scale replica of the ambassador's residence where the commandos trained survives as the Museo Contemporáneo Chavín de Huántar, a reminder of the operation that changed Peru's history.